So today we're talking about session players. We're going to talk about what session players are, why session players are used, how you can become a session player, what you need to have prepared to use session players. So what are session players? Well, session players are generally musicians that are brought into play on recordings, although they can also be used in live performances. Sometimes they're there to supplement the musicians. Sometimes they're the only musicians on the project. It really depends on the circumstances. Great example of this is the Wrecking Crew. The Wrecking Crew was a group of musicians in Los Angeles. And in the 60s and 70s, they literally were on thousands of studio recordings. Very, very influential and important studio recordings. They collectively recorded several hundred top 40 hits. Just imagine that for a moment. That is just an enormous amount of quality work and consistent work. The interesting thing, or one of the very interesting things about them, is that they were never publicly recognized during this time. It was only afterwards. And now they are considered, there needs to be a stronger word than legendary, and well-deserving as well. So many artists and so many songs that you would be familiar with from this era are as significant as they are because of this group of musicians called the Wrecking Crew. Another example is the Funk Brothers. This was the band that was basically the core of what came out of Motown Records. And pretty much every Motown song that you can think of pretty much had the Funk Brothers on it in one form or another. And they are considered to be, again, one of the most significant groups of musicians ever. Hugely influential, brilliantly talented, just incredible body of work. And of course, just about every single movie score you've ever heard played by session players. Those orchestra members, that's their gig. They come in, they play the movie score down, they come in for the next one and play the next movie, and on and on and on. Lots of session players doing lots of different things all the time. So there really is this kind of network of musicians that develop in various cities. Pretty much everywhere there are musicians that the local studios and producers know are capable of doing this kind of work, and they get brought in all the time to be part of various projects by all kinds of artists. So why would you use session players? Well, there's a number of reasons why you might consider using them. First of all, there's an instrument that you want on a recording that you yourself don't play. Another possibility is that you're already playing another part and you want to get a more of a live feel rather than having to do everything as an overdub. Maybe you're looking to collaborate or insert some new or just some different energy into your music. Sometimes the artists want, or the label want, multiple versions of a song, so they'll do one version, maybe the artist with the band, or the artist is the band, and then somebody will want to remake it at the label or the producer or even the artist themselves, and they'll bring in other musicians to be able to make that happen. Sometimes those session players can also be a live band later on because they already know the material, or sometimes a hired band can be brought in that was out on the road with somebody to then record their album. Again, lots of possibilities, lots of options, but frequent in the industry for decades and decades and decades, session players, regardless of how or why, just they've always been part of things. And it's not just about solo artists either. A lot of times session players can be on band projects. Sometimes the record labels might even force a band to use a session player or session players if they feel that the band can't handle it. There's a lot of examples of this, a lot of behind-the-scenes stories you can research about bands and musicians getting very upset about this. But labels tend to get their way, and this happens, unfortunately, more often than not. You know, sometimes people bring in session players just because they want to add in something new or interesting or a variation on what they already do. It's not about egos. It's not about not being able to do something that works for the public. It's just, hey, I've got this idea. I know this person, it might be kind of fun to see what happens. We take a song that we've already got a version of, let's see what else we can do with it. Beatles did this, even with, Billy Preston came in towards the later part of the Beatles run and just added a new kind of energy, added a new kind of sound to things. So you got to figure if the Beatles can bring in other people, then maybe it's okay to bring in other people. And session players aren't just unknown musicians or people you've never heard of. A lot of times, very famous and popular musicians will also work as session players. And sometimes this is because they're friends and they want to collaborate, or maybe it's because their label or they themselves are interested in getting more exposure and they figure that being involved in another person's project is a good way to do that. And it's a very, very common thing. We see that a lot nowadays. So-and-so featuring so-and-so and whatnot. Works really, really well for everybody. So let's say you decide you want to use session players. So what do you need to have ready if you're going to bring in some session players for your own project? Well, you're going to need the core elements of the music. You're going to need to know, what's the melody and what are the chords and what are the lyrics if there are any. You're going to have all this stuff ready to go for the session players because you don't want them to be wasting their time or having to guess at things. You're going to probably want to have some kind of working arrangement, at least as a starting point. You're going to want to know the tempo and the style, the feel you want, things like that. The more information you can give the session players, the more likely they can give you back what it is that you're hearing in your head, what it is that you want. What kind of instruments do you need? All these, like I said, these core elements of the music are really, really critical. We need a scratch or a demo recording usually, some kind of reference. It could just be a voice memo on your phone or something, worst case scenario, although some people will have pretty well done, demo recordings that sound like they're pretty much the real thing even to give to session players. It really just depends on circumstance. Now the truth is you don't need to do any of this if you don't want. You could just bring in session players and just kind of see what happens, and there's nothing wrong with that. But it's going to get expensive and it's going to take a lot of time, which may or may not be a problem depending on your circumstance. So it's something to think about. But generally speaking, we want to go in kind of knowing what we're dealing with in advance. So why should you be a session player? Beyond using them, why would you want to be one? Well, there's a lot of reasons. First of all, it's a great way to make a living. You can make a good living if you are a reliable session player. You can forward your own music via connections. You're playing something on somebody else's project, and during a break you start talking about things, or you kind of start playing on one of your own riffs and people get interested and like, hey, what's that thing? And you're like, oh, it's a piece I'm working on for myself. And you're making connections as you're working as a session player. You never know where these things might lead. One of the things that's nice about being a session player is you're not responsible. You're responsible for your part. You're responsible to do whatever the artist, the producer, the engineer might ask you to do. But if the project tanks or fails, that's not necessarily on you, which means you can go and just be there for the music. You don't have to worry about paying for the promotion or where's that money going to come from to pay for the sessions and all that other stuff. You can just be the musician. The other thing that's nice about that too is there's always going to be new music to explore. Getting called to play on sessions means there's always something new coming, something not expected, something maybe you hadn't done before that you get to try out. It's a great way to just be creatively moving forward constantly. Now, something that you should know though is that generally speaking, when you're a session player, you don't get a say in the process. You're there to lend only what the artist or the producer asks of you. So you want to be the best at what you do, but you don't want to overstep. You don't want to be like, hey, you should do this or you should do that, or this is how it's going to go. Generally speaking, a session player, you're there for a specific role. You don't want to lose the gig or future gigs by overstepping. So, how do you get to be a session player? Well, first of all, you got to be reliable. This means not only showing up on time, but it means you know the music and you know your gear and you understand how it's all going to integrate together when you walk in the door. That's really important. Maybe even more so, you got to be easy to work with. If you've got an ego, if you're arrogant, you're not going to get asked back. You've got to be able to work with other people because you're working on their music and it means something to them. And it can mean a lot. In fact, For a lot of us, it means everything. So you got to be easy to work with. Versatility is kind of an interesting thought in this regard, because in some ways, certainly the more you know, the more you can do, the more gigs you can get. But on the other hand, there are a lot of session players who are known for very specific things, and they get called in to do those very specific things, particularly on bigger projects. So there's a balance to strike here, but I'd say overall, the more you know, the better. The more you can do, the better off you're going to be long term. The other thing is that sometimes you might do everything perfectly in a session, and then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, the producer or the label or somebody decides they're going to go a different direction. You need to be prepared for that reality, and it really makes a difference how you handle it. You're a session player. You're compensated for what you contribute, but maybe they decide later to not use that contribution. That needs to be okay. If that's a problem, being a session player is probably not for you. So, how do you get compensated? This is going to vary a lot, but as you develop your career, there's a couple of things that seem to generally happen. First thing is you're going to gain experience. So as an amateur or as a younger musician, just take every gig you possibly can, because the more gigs you have, the more gigs you'll get. People want to know that they're working with people that are proven in general, so you got to start somewhere. So experience is not worthless, and it's not nothing. And it can come from just playing for your friends to playing for other musicians that you meet, and on and on and on. But get the experience, because nothing takes its place. Now, eventually you wind up mostly with something called pay for hire, and that just basically means there's a fee. Sometimes the fee's negotiable, sometimes there's a going rate. It depends on the circumstances. It depends on maybe where you are in your career, but you can make a pretty good living. What that means also, though, is you play the session, you get paid, and then that's it. If it sells 1 copy, you got your fee. If it sells 1 million copies, you got your fee. It's a fairly common way, although there's something called points, and it's rare, but not impossible. On bigger projects with session players who are very well known and highly respected, they may get a percentage, a point, if you will, of the total sales. They may sign on to a project. You hear about this in other industries too, particularly in movies, for example, where a cut of the profits goes to the people involved. Again, highly negotiated, not very common, but certainly out there as you go along in a career. It's definitely a possibility. And sometimes, as I mentioned already, no matter how well you're compensated, nobody knows you did it. Think back to the Wrecking Crew, for example. So many amazing songs. The public had no idea. They just were not credited on the albums. Good, bad, kind of depends on your perspective. Well paid, though. When you're uncredited but well paid, you'd be amazed. And, human nature, but that can make it work too. So what about producers and engineers? It's a little bit different. Producers and engineers, in a way, are kind of by design session players almost. They're brought in for a particular project or a particular circumstance. But the role of a producer, the role of an engineer is a bit different. Certainly, some artists will become familiar with a particular producer or engineer and decide that they really like them and want to continue using them in the future. But it's not really the same as a session player. It's just got a different kind of set of variables about it. Although sometimes a producer or an engineer might also be a session player on a project. They might pick up an instrument and add something themselves as well. And then obviously at that point we're back into session player in a way, even though they also have this dual role in this case of being the producer or the engineer possibly on the project as well. So what's next? Well, here's what I want you to do. I want you to take the concepts assessment, and as part of that, you're going to find an example of a successful or influential session player of your own, and there'll be a question on the concepts assessment asking you to fill in a little bit of information about them. If you're able, something to think about is to think about what of your past projects might benefit from adding in session players. Could you develop a live performance that incorporates session players, or add additional players maybe to your band just to see what that does live. How does that change things? Could you track some new versions? What, again, would that be like, and how would it compare to what you've already done? Do you think maybe you could be a session player for somebody else? Could you play on somebody else's project? What could you offer, and how would you go about making that happen?